Hated so much they were banned for life in Top 8 actors hated by Johnny Carson Mostin, https://www.youtube.com/watch?v=ffeed UK Juhaun. The protege and the threat. When loyalty turned to Warren for decades, Johnny Carson was America's nightly ritual, a smooth voice, a mischievous grin, and the promise of laughter before bed. But behind that effortless charm lived a man who demanded quiet loyalty and absolute respect. For Carson, The Tonight Show wasn't just entertainment, it was his kingdom. And like every kingdom, there were rules, unspoken, unforgiving rules. Cross them, and the laughter stopped. Forever, among the hundreds of celebrities who sat across from Carson's iconic desk, only a few ever truly mattered to him. But the story of Joan Rivers, the witty, trailblazing comedian who went from his trusted protege to his most painful betrayal, would change both their lives forever. Joan wasn't just another guest. She was Johnny's discovery, his chosen heir to the late-night throne. Carson saw in her a reflection of his own brilliance. Sharp, fearless, and capable of commanding an audience with razor-edged humor. He adored her rise, often inviting her back and championing her as the future of comedy. The two developed a bond that blurred the line between friendship and mentorship. When Johnny looked at Joan, he saw the one person who might carry his legacy. NBUT success has a cruel way of testing loyalty. In 1986, the unthinkable happened. Fox Television, desperate to compete with Carson's NBC empire, offered Joan Rivers her own talk show. The catch? It would air in the same late-night slot as The Tonight Show. Joan was torn. She knew what the offer meant, her own show, her own stage, her own legacy, but she also knew what it would mean to Johnny. To him, The Tonight Show wasn't just another job, it was sacred ground. To go up against him was heresy. Yet, when she sought advice from her husband and manager, Edgar Rosenberg, he pushed her toward independence. After all, Carson had ruled for 25 years. Would he ever truly let someone else take his place? And so, Joan made a fateful decision. She accepted Fox's offer, but she didn't call Johnny first. When Carson found out from the news, not from her lips, the betrayal struck like a knife. Those who knew him say he didn't yell, didn't curse. He simply went silent. The next day, he banned her from The Tonight Show. Her name was erased from NBC's lips as if she had never existed. Producers were instructed never to mention her again. Joan's Fox show launched to fanfare but quickly faltered under pressure. Fox executives meddled with production, and her husband's health declined. Within a year, her show was canceled, and Edgar took his own life. In her memoir, Joan confessed that losing Carson's friendship was a pain she carried for the rest of her life. She sent letters, made calls, even tried to reach him through mutual friends. Carson never responded. NFOR the rest of his career, he never uttered her name again. The woman he had once called brilliant became a ghost, haunting the edges of his legacy. It wasn't until 2014, decades after his death, that Jimmy Fallon finally invited her back to The Tonight Show stage. It was a symbolic reunion. But Carson wasn't there to see it. NTO the world, Johnny was a legend. To Joan Rivers, he was the one friend who never forgave her. And in Hollywood, there's no colder punishment than silence. NNBUT. While Joan's downfall was born of betrayal, Wayne Newton's came from something far more dangerous. Anger. Newton was a Vegas icon, a man known for his velvet voice and charming smile, but behind that gentle image was a temper that could ignite without warning. For years, Carson made him the target of his monologues. Harmless jokes, or so they seemed. Johnny would quip about Newton's looks, his flamboyant style, and, increasingly, his sexuality. Jokes that reflected the casual cruelty of the era. Each punchline drew laughter from millions, but behind the scenes, Wayne Newton seethed. The jokes were cutting into his image, the very thing his career depended on. In Las Vegas, image was everything. Carson's words carried the power of gospel, and soon Newton found himself mocked in tabloids and parodied in clubs. Then, one night in 1980, Newton snapped. He stormed into Carson's office at NBC, unannounced, furious, and shaking. According to reports from crew members, Newton demanded that Johnny come out and face him like a man. Carson, taken aback, refused to engage. The two exchanged heated words, and Newton allegedly made a physical threat before security intervened. No punches were thrown, but the damage was done, and Carson was not a man who tolerated aggression. He ruled his show with quiet authority, and to challenge him personally was to challenge the empire itself. The next day, Newton's name disappeared from the guest booking list. Officially, there was no statement, no explanation. Unofficially, the message was clear. Wayne Newton was banned for life. In later interviews, Newton didn't deny his fury. He accused Carson of cruelty, of hiding behind jokes to destroy reputations. He took shots at people because he could, Newton said years later. He thought that made him powerful. Yet even as he spoke those words, he knew the truth. No one could rival Johnny Carson in his prime. And FOR Carson, that office confrontation crossed a sacred line. He could forgive arrogance, he could forgive failure, but not disrespect. Once you showed your anger, you were out. And NTWO, very different stories. One born of betrayal, the other of fury, yet both ended the same way, with silence. Carson's bans were never announced publicly. There were no press releases or dramatic statements. Just a quiet disappearance, as if these people had never existed at all. Behind the laughter, Johnny Carson held absolute power, the kind of power that could build a career with a smile or destroy it with a shrug. Joan Rivers learned that love couldn't protect her. Wayne Newton learned that pride couldn't save him. In Johnny's world, the show always went on. But once you were gone from The Tonight Show, you were gone for good. By the mid-1970s, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson had become more than a talk show. It was the heartbeat of American pop culture. Every night, millions tuned in not just to laugh, but to witness who had made it. A seat beside Johnny was the ultimate validation. It meant you'd been accepted into Hollywood's inner circle. NBUT. If Johnny gave you that stage, he expected you to treat it like a temple. To him, the desk wasn't just furniture, it was a throne. And on two unforgettable nights, two guests, Charles Grodin and Shelley Winters, forgot that rule. One thought he could outwit the king. The other tried to embarrass him live on television. Both were never seen on The Tonight Show again. It started with Charles Grodin, the deadpan genius of awkward comedy. To audiences, he was a master of the uncomfortable pause, the sly insult, the slow-burn sarcasm that made even silence feel funny. But with Johnny Carson, that style would prove fatal. N.G. Rodin first appeared on The Tonight Show in the early 1970s, charming audiences with his quiet wit and self-deprecating humor. Carson liked him instantly. Here was a man who could play off Johnny's jokes without fear, a rare guest who matched his rhythm. Their early interviews were electric, two sharp minds volleying laughs back and forth like tennis pros at the top of their game. MBUT, as Grodin's fame grew, so did his confidence. Soon he began turning his Tonight Show appearances into unpredictable comedy experiments. Instead of playing the charming guest, he'd act irritated, confrontational, even bored. He'd interrupt Carson mid-sentence, question his sincerity, or mock the very idea of being there. Audiences never knew if it was a joke or a real argument. At first, Carson played along. He loved a challenge, and Grodin's strange energy created moments of chaotic brilliance. But then something shifted. During one particularly tense interview, Grodin accused Carson, half-jokingly, half-seriously, of being disingenuous with guests, saying he pretended to care when he didn't. The audience laughed nervously, unsure how Johnny would respond. Carson's smile froze for half a second, just enough for those who knew him to sense it. That was the look, the one that meant the curtain was coming down. NTHE rest of the segment was icy. Carson's questions became clipped, Grodin's sarcasm sharper. By the end, the air between them felt toxic. Backstage, crew members whispered that Johnny didn't say a word to him afterward. One producer later revealed that Carson told his bookers 4 simple words. "We're done with that." N.G. Rodin never returned. Years later, he would try to laugh it off, saying his confrontational style was all an act, performance art before the world even knew what that meant. But for Carson, there was no art in disrespect. The host who could forgive a bad joke couldn't forgive someone who made him the punchline, and so, Charles Grodin became a quiet casualty of Carson's perfectionism, a reminder that even brilliance has boundaries. N.I.F. Grodin's downfall was subtle. Shelley Winters was pure chaos. N.S.H.E. was Hollywood royalty, a two-time Oscar winner, a woman with fire in her veins and a reputation for saying exactly what she thought. But she also had a weakness that the industry loved to exploit, her unpredictability, often fueled by a drink or two before the cameras rolled. It was 1975, and Winters had been invited to The Tonight Show to promote a new film. She arrived late, slightly disheveled, and noticeably tipsy. Backstage crew tried to keep her calm, but when the cameras went live, it was clear this would be a night no one would forget. And at first, the segment went well enough. Johnny teased her about her many marriages, and the audience roared. Shelley laughed too, loudly, perhaps too loudly, but the laughter had an edge. Then, Carson made a harmless joke about her weight. The audience chuckled. Shelley didn't. N.S.H.E. froze for a moment, her face tightening into a glare. The studio went quiet. And then, in one shocking instant, she reached for her glass of water and threw it directly into Johnny's face. N.T.H.E. audience gasped. The band stopped mid-note. For a brief, surreal second, time seemed to stand still. Carson, soaked and blinking under the studio lights, simply stared at her. Then, ever the professional, he wiped his face, forced a smile, and delivered the line that saved the night. Well, that's one way to cool off. The audience erupted in nervous laughter. But when the cameras cut, Johnny's face hardened. Shelley Winters had made the cardinal mistake. She'd humiliated him, live, in front of millions. Within hours, the ban was official. No statements, no discussion, just silence. She would never appear on The Tonight Show again. N. Winters later blamed the incident on exhaustion and too much champagne, saying she'd overreacted to a joke. But for Carson, it didn't matter. The moment was burned into his memory, a reminder of how quickly live television could turn into disaster. Behind the scenes, NBC executives were furious, not with Carson, but with the chaos that surrounded stars like Winters. One insider recalled Johnny's words after the incident. "You can't control what they do, but you can control whether they come back." And so, Shelley Winters joined the unspoken blacklist, the quiet roster of those who had crossed Johnny Carson and vanished from late night forever. What makes these two stories haunting isn't just the fall from grace, it's how ordinary the mistakes were. Grodin thought he was being funny. Winters thought she was defending herself. But in Carson's world, intentions didn't matter. Perception did. N.T.O. Carson. The Tonight Show was not a stage. It was a reflection of himself. When you disrespected that stage, you disrespected Johnny. And Johnny never forgot. After their bans, both Grodin and Winters spoke fondly of the show in interviews, often with a hint of regret. Grodin admitted he wished he'd explained his act better. Winters said she owed Johnny an apology. But Carson's silence endured. He never revisited their names, never allowed their tapes to re-air, never opened that door again. NHI's version of punishment wasn't rage. It was erasure. Looking back now, these moments reveal more about Johnny than any biography ever could. They show a man obsessed with control, not out of vanity, but out of fear. Fear that chaos might expose the man beneath the suit. When the camera light blinked on, Johnny Carson became the world's confidant. But off-camera he was fiercely guarded, easily wounded, and quietly vengeful. He expected perfection because that's how he survived, by keeping the world at a safe distance, behind laughter. Charles Grodin tried to play a dangerous game with irony. Shelley Winters lost herself in emotion. Both learned the same brutal truth. Johnny Carson's Tonight Show wasn't just a platform, it was power. And power, once challenged, never forgets. Their careers continued, but something intangible had been lost. The golden chair across from Johnny was more than a seat. It was validation, immortality, acceptance by the man who defined what America found funny. Once you lost that, you were no longer part of the laughter. You were part of the silence. And for those who lived by applause, silence was the cruelest punishment of all. By the late 1970s, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson had become a nightly empire. slick, untouchable, and meticulously controlled by one man's quiet perfectionism. To appear on Carson's stage meant legitimacy. To disappear from it meant something had gone terribly wrong. And two of the most puzzling disappearances in Carson's long reign belonged to Rich Little and Truman Capote. One, a mimic who made audiences howl. The other, a literary genius whose brilliance crumbled under addiction. Their downfalls couldn't have been more different, yet both ended the same way. With Johnny Carson's cold and final silence, and NFOR Rich Little, it began as a fairy tale. NTHE Canadian-born comedian was The Tonight Show's golden guest, a master impressionist who could transform his voice and mannerisms into anyone from John Wayne to Richard Nixon. When Little walked on stage, Johnny grinned like a proud older brother. Their chemistry was effortless. The audience adored the playfulness between the king of late night and the man who could become anyone he pleased. NBY the mid-1970s, Rich Little was a household name. He guest-hosted The Tonight Show dozens of times, earning laughter, respect, and ratings every network executive envied. He seemed destined to become a permanent fixture in Carson's orbit. But slowly, something changed. And insiders began to notice that Johnny grew distant. The compliments stopped. The invitations slowed. Little himself couldn't understand why. He hadn't insulted Carson, hadn't caused scandal, hadn't broken any rules. Yet one day, his booking stopped altogether. No phone call. No explanation. Just silence. And years later, whispers emerged. Crew members claimed Johnny had grown weary of Little's act. The endless impressions, the constant mimicry, the way he slipped into character even off-camera. Some said Carson found him exhausting. Others suggested envy, that Little's uncanny ability to imitate Johnny himself might have crossed an unspoken line. It was said that Carson once joked to a producer, "Rich doesn't know when to stop being other people." Behind the laugh was something colder, a feeling that Little's very talent blurred boundaries Johnny refused to blur. And so the world's greatest impressionist was erased from The Tonight Show without a trace. There was no public feud, no scandal in the papers. Just a quiet, permanent exclusion. For years, Little would insist he never knew what went wrong. But perhaps, in Carson's silent world, that was the point. When asked decades later about the mysterious ban, Rich Little sighed softly and said, "I think maybe I overstayed my welcome. Maybe I became the joke." And in truth, he had become something far more dangerous to Carson, unpredictable. NNIF Rich Little's exit was quiet and mysterious. Truman Capote's was a public spectacle, a slow-motion collapse that left viewers stunned. Capote, by then a literary legend, had written Breakfast at Tiffany's and In Cold Blood, transforming American literature. But in the 1970s, fame had devoured him. Alcohol and prescription drugs dulled his brilliance, and his once dazzling wit had turned erratic. Still, Carson adored the idea of him, a man of intellect, charm, and scandal all in one. NSO. One night in 1975, Johnny invited Capote back to The Tonight Show. It should have been magic, a sharp conversation between two masters of timing. Instead, it became one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night history. Then Capote arrived late, visibly drunk. As the cameras rolled, he slurred his words, lost his train of thought, and veered into rambling monologues that made the audience squirm. Carson tried to steer the conversation, but it was like trying to control a storm. At one point, Capote interrupted Johnny mid-question with a half-giggled confession about, quote, hating certain famous people, then laughed alone while the audience sat in stunned silence. Carson's expression hardened. He gave him a few polite chances to recover, but the train had already derailed. Within minutes, the interview ended abruptly. The band struck up the closing notes, and Truman Capote, once the darling of every talk show, was led quietly offstage. NTHAT night, Carson made a decision. Truman Capote would never appear on The Tonight Show again. In the weeks that followed, gossip columns exploded. They called it the Capote meltdown, mocking his slurred speech and glazed eyes. But behind the laughter there was tragedy. Capote's banishment marked the beginning of his final decline. His friends said he never truly recovered from the humiliation. Capote later admitted, "I was drunk." And Johnny didn't deserve that. But it was too late. For Carson, that stage was sacred. To bring chaos to it, even unintentionally, was unforgivable. Behind the curtain, crew members recalled how quiet Johnny was after the show. He didn't rant or gossip. He simply said, "That's enough," and that was it. In these two stories, Rich Little's quiet erasure and Truman Capote's public collapse, we see the same ruthless pattern. Carson's need for control. NHE didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't argue. He just ended you. No discussion, no second chances. It wasn't about revenge. It was about preservation. The Tonight Show had to remain flawless, untarnished, an oasis of laughter where Johnny was always the calm in the storm. NIF Rich Little represented the danger of outshining him. Truman Capote represented the danger of embarrassing him. Both violated invisible boundaries and both paid with silence. And yet there was a strange sadness in it all. Because for all his power, Johnny Carson wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. He was, in many ways, terrified of losing control, of losing the magic that made The Tonight Show untouchable. His bans were a kind of defense mechanism, a wall between his perfect world and the chaos of human imperfection. Little went on to Las Vegas stages, where he kept making audiences laugh with his flawless impressions. Capote sank deeper into addiction, passing away in 1984. Alone, his genius dimmed. His final Tonight Show appearance still whispered about as one of TV's great implosions. Carson never spoke publicly about either man again. To him, they had simply vanished. In the end, their stories reveal the darker side of success, the invisible price of standing too close to power. For those who entered Carson's world, the light was blinding. But once you stepped outside it, you realized how cold the darkness could be. Rich Little's laughter faded quietly. Truman Capote's voice fell into tragedy. And Johnny Carson, ever smiling, ever composed, moved on, untouched, unchanged, and entirely alone behind that famous desk. Because in the world of late-night television, forgiveness might make for a good headline. NBUT for Johnny Carson, silence was always the final act. By the time Truman Capote stumbled onto Johnny Carson's stage in 1975, The Tonight Show had already become a symbol of class, control, and comedy precision. Every guest who walked through those famous curtains understood that Johnny was the conductor, and the show was his orchestra. You didn't just talk with Johnny. You played with him, in tempo, in rhythm. But that night, when Capote appeared, the rhythm shattered. And Capote was no ordinary guest. He was one of America's most celebrated authors, a man who could silence a room with a single sentence. His masterpiece, In Cold Blood, had made him literary royalty, and his social circles included everyone from Jackie Kennedy to Andy Warhol. But by the mid-70s, Capote's fame had begun to fade, buried beneath alcohol, heartbreak, and a growing reputation for self-destruction. When NBC invited him to appear on Carson's couch, it was meant to be a comeback moment, a chance for the world to see Truman, sharp and witty once more. Instead, it became one of the most uncomfortable train wrecks in television history. NHE walked, or rather, swayed, onto the stage in a pale suit, eyes glassy, voice trembling. From the very first moment, it was clear something was wrong. He slurred through his introduction, stumbled over Johnny's questions, and laughed at strange private jokes that no one else understood. The audience's laughter began to fade into uneasy silence. Carson, the consummate professional, tried to steer the ship, asking lighter questions, shifting the tone, but Capote couldn't keep up. Then came the breaking point. When Carson gently teased him about his flamboyant lifestyle, a comment meant in jest, Capote snapped. He rambled about phony people in Hollywood and cowards hiding behind their jokes. His words hung heavy in the air, his bitterness naked for all to see. Carson's face hardened. That signature smirk vanished, replaced by the quiet mask he wore when someone crossed an invisible line. Within minutes, Carson cut to a commercial. When the cameras returned, Truman Capote was gone. NHE was never invited back. NTHAT night became legend in late-night lore, a cautionary tale whispered among publicists and producers. For Johnny, the offense wasn't just the drunkenness. It was the loss of respect. Carson believed every guest owed the audience dignity, and when Capote turned his segment into a spectacle, he broke that sacred rule. Behind the scenes, NBC executives reportedly received a simple note from Carson's office. He's done. Capote's career never recovered from that humiliation. His health deteriorated, his friendships evaporated, and his once brilliant voice dimmed. He died less than a decade later, and in the unspoken history of The Tonight Show, his name became a ghost. One of those few who had tested the king and been banished forever. NBUT. What made Carson's band so fascinating, so haunting, even decades later, wasn't just their finality. It was what they revealed about him. To understand why Carson exiled people so absolutely, you have to understand the man himself, the guarded, wounded perfectionist beneath the polished veneer. Johnny Carson was, in many ways, a contradiction. On camera, he was warmth incarnate. Smiling, quick-witted, effortlessly likable. Off camera, he was private, even cold. Few people knew the real Johnny. He didn't attend Hollywood parties, didn't mingle with the elite. He preferred seclusion, sailing alone, or retreating to his Malibu home, where he surrounded himself with silence and the ocean breeze. Friends and insiders often said that Carson's true fear wasn't confrontation. It was vulnerability. He hated being mocked, humiliated, or made to look foolish. His control over The Tonight Show was, in essence, a control over his image. To embarrass him publicly, or to disrespect the sanctity of his stage, was to pierce the armor he'd spent a lifetime building. That's why his bands weren't impulsive. They were deeply personal. They were his way of saying, "You made me lose face, and for that, you're erased." When Rich Little disappeared from the show without explanation, it wasn't about impressions or recycled jokes. It was about irritation, exhaustion, and pride. When Joan Rivers launched her rival show, it wasn't business. It was betrayal. When Truman Capote stumbled drunkenly before America, it wasn't entertainment. It was exposure. Every one of these offenses cut at the same nerve. Control. Carson never yelled publicly, never aired his grievances in the press. His revenge was quieter, sharper. You simply stopped existing in his world. He wielded silence as a weapon. And because The Tonight Show was the most influential platform on television, being banned by Johnny was professional death. It's easy now to look back and see these bans as harsh or egotistical. But in Carson's mind, they were necessary. He believed his show's integrity depended on discipline. One chaotic guest could ruin the chemistry, derail the rhythm, and stain the reputation of a program that millions watched religiously. Carson's Tonight Show wasn't just entertainment, it was an institution. And Johnny, ever the craftsman, guarded it with the same precision a surgeon guards his tools. As the years went on, that control became his shield. The smile grew more polished, the jokes tighter, but the walls higher. He rarely gave interviews, and when he retired in 1992, he slipped away from public life almost completely. He watched television quietly from his home, refusing to return to the spotlight that had defined him for 3 decades. And yet, for all his coldness, there was something tragic about Carson's reign. Many who knew him said he was capable of deep loyalty if you stayed on his good side. He adored guests who respected the craft, who came prepared, who played along with the rhythm of late-night theater. People like Robin Williams, Don Rickles, and Bette Midler became part of that golden circle. For them, Carson's laughter was real, his warmth genuine. But once you broke that trust, once you disrupted his sanctuary, there was no going back. Decades later, the stories of those 8 banned guests have become a kind of Hollywood mythology, a reminder of how absolute Johnny's power was. In an era before social media, before streaming, before the 24-hour news cycle, The Tonight Show was the gate to fame. Johnny Carson decided who walked through it. And when he closed that gate, it stayed closed. Joan Rivers found her own kingdom in time. Wayne Newton rebuilt his empire in Las Vegas. Charles Grodin turned his defiance into an art form. Shelley Winters, Rich Little, Truman Capote, all of them became footnotes in the story of one man's unyielding reign. NBUT. Perhaps the real revelation is this. Johnny Carson's bands weren't about hate. They were about heartbreak. For all his confidence and charm, Carson was deeply human, wounded by betrayal, disillusioned by ego, and terrified of losing the one thing he valued above all else: control. When he died in 2005, tributes poured in from across the world. Most remembered his laughter, his impeccable timing, his decades of joy. Few mentioned the exiles. But somewhere, in the quieter corners of show business, the memory lingered. The knowledge that behind that desk once sat a man who could change your life with a smile, or erase you with a whisper. Because for Johnny Carson, forgiveness wasn't part of the show.